Hi guys, and welcome back. Let's go take a look at some of the concrete work and see how that was accomplished. This is the stonework on the exterior of the Village House restaurant. Let's go take an up-close look at how that texture was created. Most of the stonework is blocked out with high-density foam, insulation foam. That's adhered to the wall. And then a modified thin set is applied to the outside, and then a high strength mortar is applied to the surface of that, and that high strength mortar is what receives the tooling. Most of it is done just by the tip of a brush, and it's an old worn out brush. I'll try to get a picture of that. It doesn't leave the brush marks, it just kind of migrates the mortar into whatever desired shape you want. Then once that has cured and it's hard enough, then I take that same brush and I just knock down the points so it's nice and smooth so it can be painted. When the mortar is applied to the foam, I leave a gap essentially for the mortar. And the mortar is pressed in and then tooled with a stick. I've got a stick that's the approximate width, which is 3/8 to a 1/2 inch wide. And that is drawn around and scratched out, then brushed out, just like you would a typical mortar joint if you're not using metal tools. The color is left the same. It isn't painted. The stones are painted, but the mortar is left the same, so it looks like it's actual mortar holding in colored stones. The rock work here on Snow White's Scary Adventures is done basically the same, where there was a foam applied to, this has a curved sheetrock face behind it, and the foam was applied to the surface of that, covered with the thin set, and then the mortar applied by hand, and then I used my fingertips more than the brush, and that was to give this dimpled surface more like a pockmark type stone. This is an example where I would occasionally leave my fingerprints, the marks of my hand, as kind of a signature, I guess, of the work that I did. The rock work for Snow White's Scary Adventures is done basically the same way as the stonework for the Village House restaurant, with the exception of it is designed or tooled to be a little flatter, more like worked rock rather than rough stone. The rock work for the doorways around Snow White's Scary Adventures is done very similarly. Except the surface, the ultimate surface, is troweled flat. The surface is manipulated with the brush to be somewhat smooth, but then when you take the trowel and draw it over the top, it leaves these more naturalistic indentations, and it can catch the paint and actually give it more of a weathered look as well. Like here's an example down here where the paint has kind of pooled and gives it more dimension. This is an example of a different method. The mortar was applied to a wood core with the modified thin set in between. I always put the modified thin set. It gives the mortar something to hold on to. This then had a dry release agent applied, and then it was stamped with texture stamps that I made, taken from rocks that I have out in the front of my house. You know, this is an example of the same method. The mortar was applied and stamped with a stamp, a texture stamp. This rock work was done almost exactly the same way as the tooled stone in the entryway of Snow White's Scary Adventures, with the exception of the layer prior to smoothing out was left relatively rough, and then only some of it was knocked down. That gives it more of a rough hewn look, but somewhat prepared. Now this wall for the exterior of Geppetto's workshop has the sheetrock behind, then it has a layer of thin set over the top of that, then the mortar was applied by hand, just kind of squished on there, and then a couple of different brushes were used. The same soft brush that I used to create those other stone textures, plus a more coarse brush with stiffer bristles, was used to kind of tap it and force this into the shape that it is now. Okay, let's take a look at this texture. When this was framed out, it was covered with sheetrock and thin set applied to the exterior of that. Then the mortar was applied to the surface of that, and then a really stiff brush was used to create this background texture, and then it was just lightly troweled over the top just to kind of knock down the high points. Once that was dry, then just lightly brushed over the top again, just to knock off the sharp points that were left. Now this is the last section of rock that I did. This is the area that has the two hidden doors in it. The joints blend in with the rock. And this was done essentially the same way, just the foam blocking out the body of the rock, and then the mortar tooled on the surface. And this is tooled somewhat smoothly, so it doesn't protrude too much out into the hallway. And I'll show you these joints up close. Now this is where the edge of the door actually is, and you'll see when you open it up how it blends in with the mortar joint. And that's to give a completely hidden look, so it doesn't give the appearance of any type of access way there. Now these are the stones with the last texture that I'll show. These were actually the very first stones that I did in the basement. And these have a interior core of plywood that was applied to the wall, and grout actually was put directly on the outside of that, applied by hand, and then I just rubbed it and to get the rough shape. If you have any additional questions about how I did any of the concrete work, or if there's anything specific that you'd like me to do a video on, anything you'd like me to talk directly about, please leave me a message, send me an email or comment down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.